Hi there. Are you feeling poorly because you've been poked in the eye by a raven, scratched by a black cat, or accidentally on purpose buried alive by your sibling? Well, you can say nevermore to those nasty bumps and bruises with Edgar Allan Poe bandages. Definitely not a sponsor of this video. In 1875, Edgar Allan Poe, one of America's most iconic literary figures, was laid to his final resting place here at Westminster Hall and Burial Ground in Baltimore, Maryland. Or was he? The death of Edgar Allan Poe is shrouded in intrigue and mystery. As one of the most celebrated and influential figures in literary history, Poe's life was an equal measure of triumph and tragedy. Now, the circumstances surrounding his untimely demise are just as macabre and mysterious as some of the stories he wrote. Despite numerous theories and conjecture, the exact events leading up to Poe's death on October 7th, 1849, in Baltimore at the age of 40, remain unknown. Now, numerous theories abound about Poe's untimely demise. Everything from a heart attack, to rabies, to carbon monoxide poisoning, to a brain tumor, to cholera, to syphilis, to influenza, and even murder. You name it, and Poe probably died from it. One of the most popular theories is that he was a victim of cooping. Now, cooping was a form of electoral fraud that was going on in the 19th century. And this is where individuals were abducted, drugged, and forced to vote multiple times under different identities during elections. And it's believed that Poe may have been a victim of this practice. Now, according to this theory, Poe was kidnapped, given alcohol or drugs to keep him compliant, and taken to various polling stations around Baltimore City and casting fraudulent votes. He would then be taken back, forced to change his clothes and maybe even put on a wig or a hat, and go back to those same polling stations to cast more fraudulent votes. Now, while this might seem far-fetched, cooping was a thing. And there was an election happening on the day that Poe was found in the gutter in Baltimore City. Now, it would also explain why Poe was found disheveled and in a disoriented state and wearing strange clothes that most definitely weren't his. Now, Poe was found on October 3rd. Poe was found on October 3rd, 1849, by Joseph Walker, who described him as being in a state of great distress and in need of immediate attention. And while the cooping theory appears to be the most logical explanation, there's no proof that that's what actually happened. Now, Poe was taken to Washington College Hospital, where he was placed under the care of Dr. John Moran. Now, Dr. Moran said that the night before Poe died, he kept shouting out the name Reynolds. Now, who Reynolds was, or if Reynolds was really anybody, and what the relationship was to Poe, well, that remains one of the biggest mysteries surrounding his death. But the drama didn't end with Poe's death. When Poe died in 1849, fewer than 10 people attended his burial. Now, the exact number, like everything else associated with Poe, is under speculation. Now, he was placed in a basic mahogany coffin without handles or a nameplate or any other luxury, if you will, and buried in the Poe family plot at Westminster Presbyterian Cemetery. Now, his grave remained unmarked, so he would remain there for 26 years. Now, in 1860, Poe's cousin, Neilson Poe, did order a headstone made of white Italian marble for Poe's grave. But like everything else with Poe, there was some kind of weird thing that had to happen. And in this case, there was a freak accident where a train jumped the rails and crashed in to the stone yard, and Poe's recently finished tombstone was smashed to pieces beyond all power of restoration. And Nielsen Poe didn't have the funds to have another one made, so with the exception of a small block with the number 8 on it, which may have been a temporary marker showing where the headstone would go, that was the only thing that marked the grave. There was nothing there indicating that it was Edgar Allan Poe who was lying underneath it. Now here's where things get really interesting, because at the time of Poe's death in 1849, Baltimore was a hot spot for the resurrection trade, aka body snatching. Now, Baltimore had a temperate climate that kept the ground from freezing, making it possible to resurrect bodies even in the winter, something that couldn't be done further north or west. And access to the railways made it pretty easy to transport those bodies up to the New England medical schools, as well as out west to the Midwestern medical schools. And Baltimore had its own share of medical schools that were in need of lecture material. All these components made Baltimore a prime market for the resurrection trade, and as Poe's body was placed in an unmarked grave very near to one of those medical schools, it would have made him a pretty easy target for body snatching. And of course, the rumors abound that Poe's body had indeed been stolen and sold to the University of Maryland School of Medicine. But my favorite story about this is that Poe was resurrected by French body snatchers who stole his body and then took it back to Paris. No, not that one. This one.
Vive la France!
But this is highly unlikely, because at the time that Poe was exhumed from his grave, they did open the coffin and took a peek inside, and the body was described as being in almost a perfect condition and lying with the bony hands reposing one upon the other, as they had been arranged in death. The skull bore marks of greater decay, the teeth from the upper jaw having become dislodged, but those in the lower were all in place, and some little hair was still clinging near the forehead. Yet there were still some who contended that that wasn't Poe's body, not because Poe had been stolen, but because they had exhumed the wrong body. Now, because Poe's grave was unmarked and the accuracy of the records of the cemetery at the time were kind of questionable, there was argued that there was some confusion over where Poe's body actually was. And that led to the exhumation of a War of 1812 militiaman named Philip Mosher Jr. instead of Poe. And now, adding to the fire of speculation, there was also a statement by the former commissioner of the Baltimore City Police Department, John Legg Sr., who stated that he was told that Poe had been buried in a lead-lined oak coffin bearing a brass nameplate. And at the end, when Poe was exhumed, there was neither a trace of oak nor lead, nor was there any brass plaque bearing an inscription. Now, why Legg was told that, again, no one knows where that came from. But what we do know is that when Poe died, Henry Herring, his uncle by marriage, provided a basic mahogany coffin. And that's what they unearthed, was in fact a mahogany coffin. And it was pretty badly decayed. Several splintered pieces from the coffin were collected as souvenirs, and one was even made into a penholder. What a befitting tribute. Now, in addition to the documentation of the coffin that Poe's uncle provided for him, the caretaker at the time of Poe's burial, who was actually at Poe's burial, was a man named George Spence. Now, George Spence was also there at the exhumation of Poe in 1875, which means that Spence would have spent 26 years as the caretaker of the cemetery, showing interested people the grave of Edgar Allan Poe. So I think it's safe to assume that Spence knew where Poe was and that they did in fact dig up Poe's remains and place them under the monument and not the remains of the militiaman. For 26 years, Poe's resting place remained unmarked and neglected. It was overrun by weeds, and the grave was in a really sad state. When a poet named Paul Hamilton Hayne visited the grave, he was so distressed by the state that he found it in that he wrote an article which was published in several newspapers calling out the fact that Poe's grave was in such a bad state. Now, this was seen by Sarah Sigourney Rice, a young Baltimore schoolteacher who headlined the effort to raise funds for Poe's memorial monument, and donations came in from all over the world. Now, the monument was crafted by a combined effort of Baltimore artisans, and the cost was just over $1,500, which is about $42,000 in today's money. Now, the formal dedication took place on November 17th, 1875, and was witnessed by a large crowd that filled the cemetery, blocked the streets, and crowded about the windows and rooftops of every house in the neighborhood. And letters from fellow poets like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and Alfred Lord Tennyson were read, while Walt Whitman himself paid a visit in person. After 26 years, Edgar Allan Poe finally got the recognition and respect that he deserved. Now, so what do you think? How do you think Poe died? And do you think that it is Poe's body underneath the memorial? Well, if you'd like to do a little of your own research, I'll put links to my sources below. And if you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing, because there'll be more coming soon on History by the Book. Bye-bye.